Nvidia is flying higher than almost any stock in history, but its $3 trillion empire has a secret moat that could also be its Achilles heel: CUDA, an 18-year-old software fortress that's kept every rival at bay. The irony: the very AI that Nvidia built and trains at global scale might be smart enough to write the software that finally breaks that moat. Let's take a look. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. Today I want to talk about Nvidia and their massive gamble on their $500 billion data center expansion, or as Jensen Huang likes to put it, their token generator factory. $500 billion, or $500 billion, is a staggering bet based on Nvidia's belief that they can retain their monopoly level demand. But that could be in danger, and it could be in danger from Nvidia itself, which is kind of ironic, as I said in the intro. An analogy for this would be Intel in the early 2000s. They had been dominant for years. I mean, everybody remembers Wintel, right? Windows and Intel together inside. But in the early to mid 2000s, just after Intel had bet a huge bet on building a new foundry, that dominance slowly faded, and now Intel is in such dire straits that the US government has stepped in and invested money in Intel in order to keep at least one US foundry alive, if not well. So the problem here is that Nvidia's valuation, the stock valuation of over $3 trillion, is based on basically a monopoly. They need to retain essentially a monopoly in the GPU hardware space. That, of course, is the basis of all this AI training that's going on and a lot of the inference. So the problem is that if Nvidia loses even some hyperscaler customers, in other words, their biggest customers, the financial hit could be catastrophic given Nvidia's valuation and their capex and their investments over the next several years. So here's the thing. Of course, Nvidia has built their moat on hardware, but just as much that moat has been built on a secret sauce. In other words, CUDA and things that are based on that: cuDNN, TensorRT LLM, NCCL, NIMS, etc. They, of course, have also built part of their moat on stack integration. In other words, their low-level hardware plus NVLink, plus all of this software allows them to seamlessly go from a single GPU up to an entire data center, or as Jensen Huang puts it, a token generation factory. But of course, any moat is a two-edged sword, and on the hardware front, we've seen a lot of other companies, including at the forefront, companies like AMD and Amazon and Google, etc., that have been working really, really hard on the hardware. But the issue for everyone, all of us users of AI, is that we rely on CUDA. And so CUDA for years has been the moat and has been growing as a moat for Nvidia, but that could be broken, and it could be broken by CUDA itself. So one problem with CUDA is that Nvidia has promised that every new version of CUDA will be backwards compatible back to version 1.0 code. And that, while it's really fantastic and people very much appreciate it, and trains a lot of legacy architecture into the modern code. And of course, CUDA makes switching really, really hard for other users, but it also slows down Nvidia's own evolution. And the problem with that drag is that that's exactly the place where other companies can break in. So they can develop new hardware, but they can also develop new software that doesn't have those legacy code constraints that CUDA does. And of course, we've begun to see this with AMD, for example. They've got ROCm 7 plus their MI300s, which has allowed them to actually narrow the gap quite a bit with Nvidia. But of course, to be frank, they're still way behind on ecosystem maturity. We've also got Google with their TPUs and OpenXLA, which is efficient and portable, but it is also tied to their TPUs in particular. And then, most interestingly perhaps, we've got AWS with their Trainium and Inferentia, which is accelerating inference adoption inside of AWS. For example, SageMaker, which is their AI generator inside of Amazon Web Services, or AWS, is increasingly optimized for in-house chips, which is directly displacing NVIDIA GPUs from both Amazon's internal and customer-facing workloads. So that's a really big deal. Then, of course, we've got Microsoft Maya, which is vertically integrated into the Azure Silicon stack. And of course, as I've noted before, Apple has a dark horse silicon strategy. If you haven't caught that video, check it out up here. But basically, they have a massive amount of edge compute. In other words, things on desktops, laptops, phones, iPads, things like that, which are all out there on the edge and could actually displace some of NVIDIA's GPUs for AI that's based on edge devices rather than in data centers. Last month, I told you how I switched to a NOLA mattress because my old one left me waking up stiff, achy, and tired. And let me tell you, after sleeping on the NOLA Evolution Luxury Firm with the cooling pillow top, I can honestly say this is the best sleep I've had in years. I'm a back and side sleeper, and the way this mattress blends firm support from my hips and back with softer pressure relief from my shoulders has made a huge difference. Instead of waking up with lower back pain, I'm waking up rested and ready to go. And the cooling pillow top, it's been a lifesaver on those hot Georgia nights. I don't wake up overheated anymore. What's also given me peace of mind is how NOLA builds their mattresses to the highest quality standards. They're made in Arizona, completely in-house, everything from the foam topping to the coil system. And unlike some other brands, NOLA mattresses don't contain fiberglass or harmful chemicals, so there's no off-gassing. Just a clean, safe mattress right out of the box. And yes, NOLA mattress literally comes rolled up in a box, so it's super easy to set up. If you're nervous about buying online, NOLA gives you a 120-night sleep trial, plus a limited lifetime warranty, and even flexible payment options. Having the perfect mattress delivered to my door was so much easier than trekking out to a store. I love my NOLA mattress, and I think you will too. If you're looking for a new bed, head to nolamattress.com/drknowitall and use code DrKnowitall to get an extra $50 off your mattress on top of whatever discounts are already there. Big thanks again to NOLA Mattress for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to it. So the deal here is that these companies don't need to win over everyone. They don't need to replace Nvidia entirely. They just need to replace part of their Nvidia spend with their own internal chips. And that will cause a huge disruption to Nvidia because, again, their stock price, their capex, all of that is pretty much based on Nvidia being a monopoly for the foreseeable future. So how could this happen? Well, the way this could work, and it's very ironic, of course, is that these companies will use Nvidia's GPUs with CUDA to write new software, to learn how to write new software for their own chips in order to displace at least part of their needs for Nvidia. And a lot of companies really want to do this. Nobody wants to depend on a single source. And of course, none of these companies really want another company to be a monopoly. They don't want them making the money. They want themselves to make that money. And so, of course, there's a big push internally for these companies to become less dependent on Nvidia. So what these companies need to do is to create AI-assisted compilers. And there are some of these that are beginning to happen. There's Triton, there's TVM, there's OpenXLA, and then they could use these compilers to generate code that can bridge the tooling gap to CUDA maybe 3 to 5 times or even 10 times faster than humans can. Now, of course, at this point, kernel validation, correctness, all of that stuff is very much in its infancy. And of course, given the fact that they are at the highest level coding in C or something, and probably something even lower level than that, this is not the wheelhouse for AI generated code, right? It likes to be at higher level stuff like Python or Rust or JavaScript or things like that. It likes to live in that world. It doesn't like to live in this really low level world. But there's no reason why these companies, these are massive hyperscale companies, they can actually use NVIDIA's GPUs with CUDA to be able to train up these systems to be able to work at these really, really low level languages and become quite good at coding at those low level languages. And that could directly replace CUDA, which breaks down one of NVIDIA's greatest moats. So the twist here is that NVIDIA-enabled AI could help rivals rebuild modern lean software stacks that are free of NVIDIA's CUDA baggage. And of course, the speed of AI coding might finally make non-CUDA platforms viable. It just hasn't been possible up to now because it just takes so much time and effort, and these companies are, 2 decades behind NVIDIA. But with the advent of AI coding and the development speed that could enable for these companies, they could catch up and at least get close to where CUDA is in just a few years instead of decades. Now, of course, let's be real, NVIDIA is not standing still here. They have, number one, gone upstack. In other words, they're not just doing bare bones kind of on the metal GPU stuff. They're building, for example, NIMS microservices that hide CUDA under enterprise level APIs. And so that builds in a bigger moat because you're interfacing with the AI at a much higher level than CUDA, of course. And so that makes it easier for non-technically savvy companies or less technically savvy companies to use their services. So that helps NVIDIA build that moat. Of course, NVIDIA is also building out their own infrastructure. That $500 billion build out of an AI factory or AI factories is obviously an attempt to dominate hardware and service layers for the foreseeable future. And of course, NVIDIA is also leveraging their partnerships. They've got OpenAI partnership, Oracle, Meta, Tesla, all of them, and many, many more. Pretty much everybody relies on NVIDIA at scale. That's why they're basically a monopoly at this point. But again, the risk here is there could be a partial defection from major customers. customers. In other words, they don't have to go completely off Nvidia, but if Amazon, Google, Microsoft, etc. just even replace 10% of Nvidia GPUs with their own internal stuff, that could be an enormous revenue loss versus expectations, because expectations for Nvidia are so high. So where are we right now? Well, I would say we are in the land of cracks, not collapse for Nvidia, but they need to be careful. Nvidia's moat for now is very much intact, and the best competitors can really do is gain niche traction right now, but in 2 to 5 years or so, we could see the results as AI-assisted software at this low level narrows the gap between these competitors and Nvidia. We could see these cloud giants begin to internalize their inference at the very least, if not some of their training. And so in 10 years, Nvidia could remain the top in frontier training, but their margins could compress sharply if even a few big players shift their workloads and do a lot of the day-to-day workload using their own internal chips with their own internal software, or even their own internal chips with open source software. That could be a major threat as well. So the real crux of things here is that CUDA has backwards compatibility. They have a lot of loyalty in the community. There's a lot of inertia. People are just used to it. They're used to using it. It goes upstack. All of that stuff is much to their favor. But AI development, the speed of AI development, and the ability to do clean sheet alternatives that don't have legacy, that's 2 decades old, could overcome that inertia. And of course, there is a huge financial impetus for these hyperscalers to move away from Nvidia, because there's a pretty major Nvidia tax. You know, the amount of money that you have to spend on Nvidia hardware and software. If they could move some of that away to internal stuff, it would make it very much worth their while to do that. And of course, if they do and they open that up to us consumers, us smaller companies and smaller people like AWS SageMaker, if it starts using their own internal chips and their own internal software instead of Nvidia GPUs and CUDA, that really could start to change the game. So my prediction is that AI won't kill Nvidia outright, but if hyperscalers are able to reclaim even 20, 25, 30% of their workloads, that $500 billion bet that Nvidia just made could turn from a moat into a millstone instead. Alrighty, folks, let me know in the comments what you think about all of this. Am I right? Am I wrong? Are you invested in Nvidia or any of these other companies? I think that might affect your viewpoint on this, but it is definitely something to think about for the next couple of years. Anyway, while you're down there, if you don't mind liking the video, it really helps other people to find it. And of course, consider subscribing for more of this kind of content. And finally, a huge thanks to NOLA Mattress once again for sponsoring today's video. Be sure to check out my link in the description or scan the QR code to get $50 off your mattress. And I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.